Hello, everyone. Happy New Year from Zach and I. I hope you're doing well. I wanted to do a couple videos where we look back together at the puzzles from the year. In this video, I'm going to take a look at all the puzzles that I published this year on Logic Masters Germany. I did make some puzzles that didn't appear in Logic Masters Germany. So, for example, I made one for the CTC Celebration app. You can hunt those down in the zetamath spreadsheet if you're interested. I'm just here going to stick to the LMD ones. In total, I published 21 puzzles on Logic Masters Germany this year. So there's actually one hanging off the bottom of the screen here if you're looking at this sort of preview screen. I'm happy to say that of those 21 puzzles, 11 of them were featured on Cracking the Cryptic, so that's pretty awesome. I'll note which of those they were as we go through the puzzles. So I'm going to talk briefly about these in chronological order. So my first puzzle of the year was Arsha, which is my S-Cells Renbon X puzzle. This is certainly one of my favorite puzzles out of the year. I love that you sort of get to start with this double X arrangement that without Schrodinger cells you could never do. It's kind of like, it really sort of frames the year nicely for me to realize that like this year started very early with me talking about S-cell puzzles. Because I sort of remember that whole phase of puzzling. You'll see that there are some other phases well represented here. So you can have a look at those. But this is one of the two S-cell puzzles that I made, and I'm really proud, in fact, actually, of both of them. This is one of a handful of puzzles that I have on Logic Masters Germany that are currently sitting at 100% rating. So I'm quite proud of this. I don't think there's anything that I'm not happy with this puzzle. If you haven't done this puzzle, and you're looking for one of my puzzles to do, I think this is a good one. And I think this one is not as brain-bending as you might think that an S-cell puzzle would automatically be. None of which is to say that it's easy, just to say that it's not as bad as some of the other S-cell puzzles, and in particular, it's definitely not as hard as my other S-cell puzzle. Next up, we have what I think is the most brain-bending puzzle I set this year, and that puzzle is antimatter. So this puzzle entirely revolves around antimatter lines. And what is it that makes something an antimatter line? An antimatter line is a line that's none of the following. It's not a Renbon, it's not a Nabner line, it's not a Whisper, it's not a Thermo in either order. And further, it's impossible to form a valid arrow out of the digits on the line. So even a 1, 5, 6, even if the 6 is in the middle, that's a valid arrow because I could make 6 as 1 plus 5. So all of those are out. So I believe it was Pulverizing Pancake that described this puzzle as oops, all negative constraints, which is really what it is. Everything in this puzzle is defined by what it isn't. There are a couple odd circles and one even square that sort of play into this, but overall, that's all it is. It's a bunch of antimatter lines. I believe this is the only puzzle of mine you will find out of my current catalog that features lines that cross. That was actually necessary for this puzzle, at least for the way that I ended up making it, because I needed to pack more information into the grid since an antimatter line by itself contains almost no information. In particular, I sort of stumbled upon these little TIE Fighter type patterns and did that. I will note, by the way, that Ranks did a particularly memorable solve video of this particular puzzle this year. It might have been memorable for the wrong reasons, but it was memorable. I do believe this is rightly rated as my worst puzzle of the year if you look at the LMD ratings. It's fine. It didn't quite come together in exactly the way that I might have hoped. I should say, actually, what my inspiration for this puzzle was. Like, why did I think this was going to be a good idea? And my inspiration, and sorry, Pater. But Pater Venus made this puzzle this year for one of the Cracking the Cryptic puzzle hunts. I don't remember exactly which one. That was an Everything is Roggen puzzle that featured lots of lines. And what Pater did in that puzzle was to make a bunch of lines that were simultaneously not any of the various standard line constraints. And then that particular puzzle had a bunch of other things as well. But my brain sort of fixated on that and was like, oh, I wonder if you could make a puzzle that was just the negative on the lines and nothing else. So although I don't think anyone perceived this puzzle in this way, for me this is really an Everything is Roggen style puzzle. That's really how my brain sort of processed this, is that these lines are sort of simultaneously all of these kinds of constraints and they're all wrong in every possible configuration. That was how my brain thought about it. I think, again, that the fact that that wasn't sort of part of the presentation, I think, is also part of why this puzzle ended up falling a bit flat. I do think, by the way, I'm not saying anything about the logic of this puzzle, because I think there's one cool thing to find, and I think if I tell you that, then the puzzle will sort of fall apart. So if you do want to do this puzzle, I do think there's a cool thing to find, but I don't think it would be possible to make a second interesting puzzle with this rule set. All right, my next puzzle this year was Kodama. This is my other S-cell puzzle. So I know a lot of people think about S-cells when they think of me. I've only actually set 2 S-cell puzzles, I believe, unless it turns out that there's a third one I'm not thinking of, in which case that will say something about that puzzle when we get to it later. But this puzzle is a German Whispers S-cell puzzle. And German Whispers are very interesting in the context of S-cells because you have 2 different digits that have to be 5 apart from another digit if you have an S-cell on one of these Whispers lines. But also, as soon as you use S-cells, you introduce an extra digit. So this puzzle sort of first and foremost actually makes you question everything you know about German Whispers and think through what of those things are still true now that I'm in a universe where I also have 0, still have to be 5 apart. Sometimes I have 2 digits on a line. There's a lot of different sort of elements here. And I think the puzzle ends up really hanging together well because all of those questions, once you think about them, have satisfying answers. But you sort of don't get to take anything for granted in this puzzle. Also, the break-in here is one of my favorite break-ins ever. And I won't say exactly what it is, but what I will say is sort of striking about this grid, if you study it and have thought about these constraints a lot, is that X's in a normal Sudoku puzzle can never sort of differentiate between 1, 9, 2, 8, 3, 7, and 4, 6. And the same is actually true of Whispers. So in a normal puzzle, you could never make a puzzle with no givens and only Whispers and X's. But with S-cells, suddenly you can, and that was interesting to me. Actually, I should go back and note, the same is actually true of Archa. You could never make a Renban puzzle that had only X's and Renban either. Again, you can't sort of differentiate the highs and the lows with those 2 constraints, except that with S-cells you can. By the way, I should answer, by the way, why this is called Archa, because I've gotten asked this a lot. So this is a result of an in-joke between Tallcat and I, where I always tease Tallcat about having typically very pretentious titles for his puzzles. And so sort of as a reference to that, I just went with, okay, what am I going to call this Schrödinger cell puzzle? And I made it the word box, but in Latin, was my effort to do this. So, for example, Doppelt is one of my favorite Tallcat puzzles, where Doppelt is, I believe, double in German. So I was sort of lightly teasing about that with this particular title. I was originally going to name Kodama the word box, but in a different language. But then by the time the puzzle was done, without me even really trying, it looked like a Japanese tree spirit, which is what a Kodama is if you're not sort of aware of it. They're even green. So I just named it that because it sort of ended up making a nice little picture that I enjoyed. The next puzzle for the year is one of the big ones, and this is the first puzzle I made this year that was featured on Cracking the Cryptic. This is Frack. So this puzzle arose out of a very simple idea, which is, wouldn't it be fun to have a region sum lines puzzle that was also a chaos construction, so you wouldn't know what the regions were when you were looking at the region sum lines? There have been probably a dozen puzzles since then with this idea, so this idea probably no longer feels like a particularly novel one. But I sort of had the idea, and then I spent a while trying to figure out how on earth to make it work. And I eventually settled around the break-in here, which sort of revolves around this giant line around the border. The giant line around the border is also why I got its name. It's why it's called Frack. Simon, when he did the puzzle, he speculated that it was named after a computer game that was published before I was born. Which, sorry, Simon, that was not the that was not the reference I was making. Instead, I was making a also very non-current reference to the Battlestar Galactica television series from about 20 years ago, where in that particular series, every bit of paper and really everything that should be a rectangle actually has the corners cut off. So every sheet of paper and every mirror and all these sorts of things, they all have this shape that sort of looks like this line. And in the Battlestar Galactica universe, rather than using real curse words, they use the curse word frack, which is supposedly like the future curse word. And so I used that as the title, also as a reference to the fact that I believed that people would find this puzzle particularly difficult and particularly likely to inspire various use of curse words. So I think it was fitting. I'm very happy with how this puzzle came out overall. I'll note that this puzzle is very heavily overclued. Almost all the circles in the grid are unnecessary. However, I wanted the puzzle to be humane, we'll say. And so I added some extra clues. There's a lot of debate among the people who tested the puzzle about, because I had some testers did the version without any of the extra clues, where I think it was truly minimal. And it was like the whole puzzle was 3 lines and 2 circles or something like that. But I'm really happy I went with this version so that at the very least, this version didn't result in a 2-hour video. It was only like a 90-minute video for Simon. But I'm really proud of this. This is not my favorite of my puzzles I've made, but it would be high on the list. And we jump from one of the hardest puzzles I made this year to one of the easiest puzzles I made this year, which is Distinction. So this is almost a vanilla Renbon puzzle, but it's not quite a vanilla Renbon puzzle, because it has one extra rule. And the one extra rule is that no 2 Renbon in the puzzle can have the same combination of digits. So, for example, if this Renbon here was 8, 9, it would sort of psychically communicate to this Renbon over here that it was not allowed to be 8, 9. And so this led to some interesting deductions where once you figured out what one Renbon was, then it sort of told you information about what the others were, and you sort of got to bounce all around the grid and figure this out. This was my second puzzle that was featured on Cracking the Cryptic this year. It was the first puzzle I actually did a live reaction video to. If you want to go back and watch my live reaction to Simon's solve of this puzzle, you can find it in the channel. In this particular case, unusually for Simon did not actually find sort of the quote-unquote intended break-in here. Simon managed to make this puzzle a bit more complicated than I think it really is, as many people told him in the comments. What he actually did is kind of amazing if you look at it. And if you really do the puzzle, solve it, and then go back and look at Simon's solve, what you figure out is he basically does the first 2 steps of the puzzle simultaneously. So sort of the intended way is, and I don't think this is a super big spoiler, the intended way is to first look at 2-cell Renbons and figure out what's happening, and then look at 3-cell Renbons and figure out what's happening. And the way Simon does it is to look at all 2 and 3-cell Renbons together, do this set argument where he highlights all of them, and then makes some argument about what the cells have to be. And if you actually carefully dissect it, he's doing exactly the logic that I intended, just by combining it all together. It's very interesting, and it's always fascinating to me to see how Simon's brain works and see that he connects these things. The next puzzle that I made this year was 10 lines. This was also featured on Cracking the Cryptic. I originally actually made this puzzle in celebration of Ranks. What was it? In celebration of Ranks. Yeah, it was in celebration of Ranks getting to 1,000 subscribers, I think. No, that's not right. It was in celebration of Ranks' 100th stream. There we go. That's what it was. And the reason for that is I sort of made up this new idea of 10 lines, which I'll talk about in a second. But the original version of the puzzle had 10 lines. This one actually has 11, just to extra bother people who are looking at this. But the reason why I thought, oh, that would be a good idea is because 10 lines, that would be 100. And it was the 100th stream, so, it all sort of fit together. Anyway, it ended up being, for purposes of solving, it was easier to have 11 lines, and I decided that mattered more than the theming. But then it led to lots of people looking at this. In fact, I think the Cracking the Cryptic video of this puzzle is titled, Are There 10 Lines or 11? But 10 lines are this idea where every line you need to break down into groups of cells that sum to 10. And this is an idea that I think ended up having some amount of legs. And so, as you'll see later, several more of the puzzles that I set this year also involved 10 lines. And I've received several really neat 10-line puzzles by other setters that I've enjoyed as well. So if you're a setter and you're interested, I really recommend trying setting with these. Also, I think this is just one of the best Simon Solve videos. It has all the intended moments, including a moment very early in the puzzle where everyone gets to that moment and is 100% convinced they've broken the puzzle and is trying to figure out how they can possibly have broken the puzzle 3 steps in. and then they have this sort of epiphany moment of what must be happening in order for that to be true. And it's all the emotion of it is captured perfectly in Simon. So I really enjoyed his solve of this, and I'm quite proud of this puzzle and this constraint overall. My next puzzle of the year, and this one was also featured on Cracking the Cryptic, is Modern Romance. So this puzzle features all of these little hearts, and the way the hearts work is that the digits are dating, and so the way it works out, there are 9 digits, so the digits couldn't all form couples. So as part of polypositivity, we have 3 couples, nothing wrong with couples, but then 1 thruple involved in there. And there's a heart between 2 digits if those digits are in a relationship. So for example, if there are 2 digits are part of the thruple, there'll be a heart between them. And any 2 digits in a couple, anytime they appear next to each other, will be a heart. And yes, this was all in aid of me writing my favorite line of rules text I have ever put into a puzzle, which is all hearts are given. Now, the way this puzzle actually works out in practice is that there's a coloring exercise at the beginning where you have to identify where the thruples are and where the couples are and sort of color almost the whole grid before you can really do anything. And then you have these sort of sandwich-like clues that give you sort of the sandwich digits between the outer elements of the thruple. And when I made this puzzle, I really did not think that this puzzle was going to be particularly popular for the reason that I think the people who the coloring part would appeal to, and the people who the rather mathy, in fact, this is probably the mathiest puzzle I've ever set, second part of the puzzle where you have to sort of solve for what the digits actually are, I figured those would appeal to 2 very different groups. And I think on some level that's true, but I also think that the theming here was very popular. And so I think this puzzle ended up being one of my more popular puzzles because of the theming. And so I think it's interesting to note, not a lot of setters, and certainly this is, I think, my only really themed puzzle. Maybe I have a couple more, but almost none. But themed puzzles do sort of have a way, especially when the theme is something compelling, of sort of generating additional interest. Most notable for me about this Simon feature is that in this video, Simon Antony says the word thruple about 200 times, and it is delightful. I found that very special. So I hope that if you watched that video, I hope that you enjoyed it as well. Next up is the puzzle Bounce. And as I often do in puzzles, this is a draw some killer cages into the grid puzzle. So you have to draw in some polyominoes of various shapes where digits can't repeat, and then the clues tell you something about those shapes. So the outside clues, for example, give you the sum of the cells that are in polyominoes in those rows and columns. And the circles here I stole from a Fistamafel puzzle. So the way the circles work, and here's my example puzzle that I can show you just so that you can understand this if you've not looked at this before, is the circles tell you something about the number of borders to cages that cell can see in its surrounding border. So it's the number of corners plus the number of lines that are on the border. So for example, this digit is a 3 because it sees these 2 corners plus this edge. And this is a 6 because it sees all 4 corners and then 2 edges, and so on. So this is an idea that appears in this excellent Fistamafel puzzle, Fistamafel's chaos construction with Slitherlink clues, as always with Fistamafel puzzle names, very descriptive. But as soon as I did that puzzle, I knew I wanted to do something with this sort of geometry. It took me a while to figure out what I was going to do with this geometry, but I was really happy with this puzzle almost. I think the solve path of this puzzle is splendid right up until the very last deduction, and the very last deduction is annoying. And funnily enough, this is one of those puzzles where I said it, I had people test it, and then people found the last step annoying, so I added a clue to make it less annoying. But it turned out that it was still annoying if you got to it. It was less annoying, but it was still actually annoying and still sort of made the last part of this puzzle not as smooth as I would prefer one of my puzzles to be. The entire rest of it, I think, proceeds beautifully. But the very end, you have to pay a little bit too much attention to something for my taste, and I'd rather I just have added an extra given digit or something just to sort out exactly what happens at the end. Like maybe throw in an 8 down here or something like that, whatever. Anyway, you could always be doing things better. Obviously, people still like this puzzle because this is another of my puzzles that's sitting at 100%. But because of that, I never submitted this to Cracking the Cryptic, and they never did it. Not to say that all the puzzles that Cracking the Cryptic does, I submitted to them. For example, now this is going to require me to remember. I know I didn't submit this to Cracking the Cryptic. I'm pretty sure I didn't submit Modern Romance to Cracking the Cryptic. When you get back to 10 lines in distinction, I don't actually remember whether I submitted them or not. I know I didn't submit Frack, because I made Frack actually for some other special occasion for Ranks, I realize I should have mentioned. But then Cracking the Cryptic did it before Ranks even saw the puzzle. But Ranks had been so traumatized by antimatter, I'm not sure that Ranks really wanted to do Frack on stream. Yeah, it actually does, even in the puzzle description, say, this is actually the puzzle I made for Ranks getting to 1,000 subscribers. Ranks, of course, is now at like over 10,000 subscribers, so Ranks is doing very well as a Sudoku and word game and GeoGuessr and other sorts of streaming. I wanted to say variety streamer, but maybe that's not quite right. Anyway, Bounce, I think, was very close to me to being a puzzle that I'm very happy with. I might revisit the idea later. It's like one clue away from perfect, which is a theme you'll see repeated later. The next puzzle of the year was MIA, and oh boy, MIA. So I can say, first of all, this is my favorite puzzle I have ever set. I really love the logic here. I really love the flow from start to finish. And the ending of this puzzle, if you've not either watched Simon's solve of this puzzle or solved it yourself, the ending is just magical. And you might think that I'm sort of tooting my own horn for finding it, but actually this puzzle, I should mention, I set this entire puzzle on camera. So from start to finish, all 12, 16, however many hours it was, over multiple days, however long it took me to set it, I recorded all of it. And then Tristan beautifully edited it down to only about 4 hours. So you can actually watch me set this puzzle from start to finish. You can see all the horrendous mistakes that I made at all these various points. And you can see me like nearly sobbing at the end when I'm trying to figure out what clue I can add to the grid at the end to actually make the puzzle solve. And the clue that I eventually found makes the puzzle solve in the most ludicrous possible way. So the sort of joke is that you basically solve the puzzle down to a single deadly pattern, and then there's a really non-trivial step to resolve the deadly pattern at the very end, and it's a complete fluke, but it's gorgeous, and I loved it. This is actually the puzzle that I had printed on a giant poster to put in my office, just so that I can like look at it, because it makes me happy to see it. I just have this grid blank and then completed next to each other. This puzzle made me really happy. Simon's solve of this puzzle made me really happy. Simon really enjoyed it. Simon actually did this puzzle on his birthday and then did a sort of live chat with people as the puzzle did. I forget what that's called, like a YouTube premiere or something like that. Anyway, I won't even complain about the fact that I had to give this stupid gray square down here. I was just really happy with this puzzle. Everything came together. It felt really fresh. I'd probably never make another puzzle with this exact rule set because I think probably I found most of the things that you could do with it, but I found it very satisfying. I was very happy with how it came together. And even better, I was really happy that this puzzle I actually set live. So everyone who watches a puzzle like this and goes, how on earth would someone make something like that? Which is, I think, a natural reaction to have to many of the sorts of puzzles that you'll see on Cracking the Cryptic. This one you can actually see. You can see every step of how this was put together, with lots of sort of fast forwarding through things where I just try something and go on a long tangent and then it doesn't work or whatever. But anyway, really recommend it if you haven't watched that or haven't looked at that. I think it's worth seeing. I think it is one of the coolest sort of video editing jobs that Tristan has done. All right, the puzzle after that is Double Dip. So this is my only Jay Dyer style deconstruction. So if you've not seen one of these puzzles before, the way it works is you have to fit 9 3x3 Sudoku boxes into this grid, but actually you can put them wherever you want in the grid. And so you have to figure out where they are, and all the other cells are just empty. And the way this ends up working with this that I was really happy with is that the clues in the grid are double arrow clues. And so what that means, if you've not seen double arrows before, is that the sum of the digits along the line is also equal to the sum of the digits on the circle at either end of the line. But what's cool about this is that lots of cells in the grid are empty. And so what therefore happens is some of the circles are empty, and then the double arrows become single arrows instead. And I liked that sort of the double arrow becomes a single arrow. I thought that was a fun little twist in the logic behind this puzzle. I really liked this one. I think this is one of the most fun puzzles I've set, at least for my sense of what fun is as a solver. I'm just really happy with how this one came together. I really recommend if you just want sort of like a jolly good time, I think this puzzle is a jolly good time to solve. There was a great deal of debate at the time because it is a secret of these sorts of deconstruction puzzles that every starred cell automatically ends up being part of a 3x3 box no matter what. And I don't really think that's a very fun deduction to make on your own, so I just immediately said that in the rules, like, hey, by the way, this is true. But there was a lot of debate amongst the setters of the world as to whether it was appropriate to do that, or whether I should let people find it out, or put it in a spoiler, or all of these various things. I'm very happy at the end of the day with this choice, for what it's worth. My next puzzle was vignettes. So this is a collection of linked 6x6s, but that's probably not what anyone would think of when they see this, if they sort of were paying attention to this, because this is the first puzzle that I made that contains the word doublers in the rules. And so in this puzzle, there are doublers, which make a digit count as double that digit. Now, this was the first time I used doublers in any way, and the rule in this puzzle was just a doubler counts as double, and no two of these 6 grids have their doublers in the same place. So you can actually look at any grid one at a time, but you can't actually solve any of the puzzles one at a time because you have to actually look at all the puzzles together to figure out where the doublers have to be. Now, the rule that would later come to be associated with doublers about not repeating them, that does not appear in this puzzle. Mark and Simon actually did a collab solve of this puzzle, which was quite fun. I really enjoyed it. So I have almost no complaints about this puzzle, except for one, which is that when I was setting this, I made an error in this box of this grid. Now, that error I made, and I know from watching a bunch of other people solve the puzzle, a bunch of other people also made the error, including Simon and Mark. And so if you make that error, the puzzle solve path is glorious and smooth, and I really like it. Unfortunately, it is just an error. And if you think carefully about the rules, you can actually realize that actually there's an option for what happens in this box that's rather annoying to rule out. Now, you might briefly, as you're hearing this, be afraid that I'm saying the puzzle does not have a unique solution. The puzzle very much has a unique solution. There is a difficult but not at all impossible to spot argument that proves to you that what you would get if you just made the mistake I did is what happens. But I really regret that I didn't notice this and didn't just add an extra dot, because there's no negative constraint in this Kropke grid, and I easily could have made that smoother just by adding one more clue. Now, you might ask why I don't go ahead and do that now, and the reason is that I discovered this only significantly after I published the puzzle. KNT was the first person who brought it to my attention, and then Ranksk also brought it to my attention. And then I was going to fix it, and then I was busy for a day, and then 2 days later, Mark and Simon came out with a solve of it. But once Cracking the Cryptic has solved it, I sort of view it as the canonical version of the puzzle. It'd be weird to go back and change it and add a clue now, so I'm not going to. But as awesome as the idea behind this puzzle is, and as awesome as the execution almost is, that one sort of like extra annoying step that sort of makes the solve path not as smooth as I would prefer it to be, sort of stops this from being in my top tier of my my appreciation of my puzzles. But everything else I really liked here. And of course, the start of the doubler trend, which you'll see show up in the next several puzzles that I made, also involved doublers in various ways. Still, I think this is a cool puzzle. I think it earns its 5 stars. I originally thought this puzzle was going to be much, much, much easier than it actually turned out to be. But it was fun anyway. I was quite pleased with it, even in spite of that. But yeah, I really wish I had noticed that when I was setting it, just so I could smooth out what was going on in this box a little bit better. Part of what happened when I set this puzzle, actually, by the way, was that I set the entirety of the puzzle and then realized that the way I had set the German Whispers grid, the puzzle could never have a unique solution. And so I needed to redo the entire German Whispers grid in order to have a unique solution. But this was a significant problem because the break-in was in the German Whispers grid. And so at the end of the puzzle, when I was setting it, I had to go back and edit the German Whispers grid so that the same logical conclusions that percolated into the other grid stayed true, while still allowing this grid to actually have a unique solution. If you're the sort of person who likes thinking about uniqueness, you can figure out what you have to do in order to make a German Whispers puzzle with doublers be unique. But anyway, this is a very fun solve to watch from Mark and Simon. I think you have to be on the Cracking the Cryptic Patreon to get access to it. But if you are and you haven't watched it, I do think it is a very fun solve to watch. All right, so next up, we have Topsy Turvy. So despite the fact that at the top it says zetamath only, because that's how LMD works, this puzzle was half me and half Tall Cat. And so the story of this is that I said when I was setting vignettes, I tried at first to use between lines. Between lines and thermos were two of the mechanics that I wanted to use, but I only had 6 grids. And between lines in particular, I noticed were very hairy if you allowed doublers. And so I ended up not using them, but I made this comment, and I made this comment in front of the undisputed king of between lines, Tall Cat himself. And Tall Cat said, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, why don't we do it? And so we did. And so this is a between line doubler puzzle. Now, this is the first puzzle that has the rule that doublers can't repeat digits. So there's 9 doublers in the grid, and they contain the digits 1 through 9. The puzzle basically could not be unique otherwise, because of how doublers interact with between lines. But that was actually an idea I had back when I was setting vignettes, but vignettes had enough going on that I didn't want to add that additional rule. But here I was pretty sure we were going to have to use it, and indeed we did. Now, what actually ended up happening here is that Tall Cat inadvertently, or quite advertently, I should say, sort of discovered the logical step behind doublers that I think makes doublers as popular as they are, which is that as you solve this puzzle, you start by figuring out where the 1 doubler is, and then where the 2 doubler is, and then where the 3 and 4 doublers are. And you sort of figure these things out piece by piece, and you're able to sort of nail down what sorts of digits can be in doublers, because as soon as you found the 1 doubler, you're never allowed to double 1 again, and so on and so forth. And in particular, the step in here that I think is most gorgeous was all Tall Cat was figuring out, oh, you can actually set up these lines in this way that you actually know where these 2 doublers are, even though you don't know exactly where either of them is, but you know they're both used. And so then that lets you make another deduction elsewhere in the grid, and then later you come back and sort out how all of that worked out. That was great, and I think if you go back and look at other doubler puzzles, that is a very common step that sort of makes doublers special. Simon did this puzzle, and it was a delightful solve. Simon basically nailed the solve path from start to finish. It was a very cool thing to see Simon do, and it was very cool working on this puzzle with Tall Cat. Tall Cat is a very close friend of the channel, and is usually when we need a celebrity guest to sort of spice up interaction around the channel, we usually get Tall Cat. So I'm looking forward to doing more puzzles with Tall Cat in the future. We have started and not quite finished a number of other collabs, so who knows? There may be more Tall Cat zetamath goodness in the future. My next puzzle this year was Medusa, which is the other thing that I wanted to do with doublers in vignettes, but didn't quite figure out how to do, / it turned out to be more complicated than I thought it was going to be, so I made it its own puzzle. And this is a doubler thermo puzzle. From here forward, for me, doublers are established as meaning there's one in every row, column, and box, and the digits 1 through 9 appear in them once each. That is very much true in this puzzle. If you look at my entire catalog of puzzles I have made, you will see this shape appear in the center box 5, sort of poking into these over and over and over again. So actually, this is a throwback to the break-in of Ambiguity 1, but I've used it in Ambiguity 1, it's in a form in Ambiguity 2, it's in Zeta's Nightmare, it's in the Eye, it's just in so many different puzzles that I've made. So this is probably the Zeta-iest pattern that you can possibly have. But yet again, it's the break-in here that sort of gets you to this. Overall, I think this puzzle's fine. There's one thing I really like, which is that at the end of the day, if I recall correctly, if you're paying attention, you get a 5, 6, 7 triple in doublers all looking at this cell, and it ends up making this cell a 4. And so you go from knowing almost nothing to knowing that this goes 4, 3, 2, 1, and then you can fill in all the digits in the puzzle immediately as singles. Which is one thing I really like about doublers, by the way, is that once you're getting towards the end of the puzzle, the fact that digits can't repeat in doublers basically finishes the puzzle for you, because it gives you a whole bunch of extra Sudoku stuff, and so you spend less time sort of on cleanup at the very end. Anyway, I'm perfectly happy with this puzzle, but it's nothing exciting in my mind. I wasn't blown away with it, but I was happy with how it worked out. As you'll see in my companion video to this, where I talk about my favorite puzzles from other people this year, there are a lot of other puzzles where people use doublers that I ended up liking quite a bit better than this one. All right. Next up is the puzzle Double Double, also featured by Simon on Cracking the Cryptic. So this is a doubler double arrow. And if you're curious what the genesis of this was, the genesis is that double and double arrow and doubler all have double in them, and so I wanted to make a puzzle that had both of them. There was really nothing more to that, and then as soon as I thought of the title Double Double, I was like, yes, I will have to do that. So here we go. So this is a doubler double arrow puzzle, which turns out to be very difficult to make a break-in for that was interesting, but I then found one that I was really happy with. So this one I like quite a bit better than Medusa, as far as my doubler puzzles go. Now, anyone who is a setter will immediately go to this one even square and be like, I hate it so much. I really did not much care for this even square either, I will be honest, but it was sort of necessary because of the way the break-in basically sets up a deadly pattern, so you're going to need to do something to break it. Now, what I realized much later is that I think I could have made this even square a given 2, and I think it would have worked equally well. And I originally ruled that out because I didn't want to have a given digit in a doubler puzzle, because my reasoning was, well, then I have to specify in the rules whether I'm giving that isn't a doubler or whether it's left to the solver to determine if it's a doubler, and that feels kind of hacky. So then I looked for other ways, then I eventually ended up settling on an even square. But if you pay close attention, you'll notice that if you give an even square in a doubler puzzle, you also have to specify whether that cell can be doubled or not. Because if, for example, the cell was a doubled 3, would it count or whatever? So anyway, in the end, it would have been way less hacky to just have it be a given 2. And I don't think it would have affected the solve path at all. And it would have been perfectly on theme with all the doubling and etc. all over the place. But anyway, that minor quibble aside, I was very happy with the solve path. I was very happy with all the pieces sort of fell into place for this one. It's not the only puzzle out of this list out of this year, but you see it has my signature there in the center of box 5. So I enjoyed this one. This one was also super fun to watch Simon solve. Next up on my list of puzzles was target practice. So if you look through my entire collection of puzzles, you will discover this is the only 2-star puzzle on LMD that I have set. Every other puzzle I have set was 3 or more stars. And my inspiration for this was basically that Meme Rister noticed that I'd never set a 2-star puzzle and basically made fun of me for it and guilted me into doing it, so then I did it. So that was sort of motivation to say, like, can I actually set a 2-star puzzle? Is there some reason I can't set a 2-star puzzle? So I sort of made myself set a 2-star double arrow puzzle. And I was really happy with what sort of came out as a result. I was really happy with the break-in and the way the logic sort of repeats through the puzzle. So I was really happy with sort of what I ended up coming up with, but it really was very much sort of from the get-go, and this is usually not how I set puzzles, but from the get-go I was like, okay, what if I just tell myself I'm not allowed to make this puzzle anything other than 2 stars? What will I end up making? That's sort of like my given goal going into the puzzle. Usually I just let the difficulty of a puzzle end up being whatever it ends up being. And if it ends up being 3 stars or 5 stars, it's fine as long as it is what it wants to be. Anyway, I was really happy with this, and you'll actually notice something that's very nice about the fact that this puzzle is a little bit easier, which is that this puzzle has the most solves out of any puzzle that I have posted and got over 100 solves almost immediately. So if you are a setter who is contemplating what will get you the most attention and most solves, certainly setting 2-star puzzles will get you more solves than setting 5-star puzzles. I don't think I have much more to say about this other than that I have been trying to set other puzzles of comparable style and difficulty. I do think it's very difficult to sort of set puzzles that sort of fall into this gap for me, but I've been trying to do it more. All right, next is the puzzle that has most vexed me out of any puzzle I have ever set. This puzzle I had very grand ambitions for, so this is the puzzle Extra. My ambition here was, this is going to be like a sandwich puzzle, except there's going to be sort of these 2 sets of doublers in the grid, or not really doublers, it'll just be 2 sort of disjoint sets in the grid that'll serve as the crusts, and you'll get to do all the sort of doubler Sudoku logic, and it'll be very cool. And there'll be this sort of like, it'll be a Sudoku X, so you won't be able to repeat stuff along the diagonals, and you'll be able to do all these things. I found all these really awesome logical steps that sort of combined and put all these pieces together, and it's like, sweet, I love all of this. Funnily enough, the sweet summer child that I was, I originally tried to make it so that every clue was a multiple of 5. You will see that very much did not end up happening in the final version, because this puzzle kept breaking over and over and over again. Until eventually, what I needed to do this puzzle was actually, I needed to basically ask someone to code a solver that would let me handle the disjoint set of doublers bit and actually check for whether there were solutions to the things I was looking at. So Woofer very kindly did that for me. Much appreciated to Woofer there for doing that. And what I learned once I actually had the solver to do this is that basically, the puzzle was broken as soon as I placed 3 clues into it, and then I kept placing a bunch more clues, and kept getting almost to the end, and it was broken, but it was actually broken almost from the very beginning. And it was quite excruciating to get this puzzle down to a point where it actually solved in a coherent way. In my draft, this was very much going to be a 5-star puzzle, because there were a lot of really sort of complicated and intricate Sudoku deductions that I thought were well telegraphed, but required a lot of careful thinking about and understanding how all these things fit together, and I really loved them, and none of them could I make work in a version of the puzzle that also actually had a solution. So that was all very, very unfortunate, and so I ended up settling for this version of the puzzle, which has some of the cool ideas, but is much easier, and because of really the power of the diagonals, that's sort of what the big problem was. Because of the power of the diagonals, this ends up being the case that you sort of like have this really linear solve path for the first chunk of the solve, but then sort of like anywhere you look, just digits fall out, and then sort of the rest of it just sort of collapses. But anyway, a lot of people told me they had a lot of fun with this puzzle, which I am very glad for. I hope never to see this puzzle ever again. But that is the story of this, and this took months of me looking at this and trying various things and them not quite working. So anyway, I will not be revisiting this idea for a puzzle, I can tell you. All right. Next puzzle, 20 lines. So this is a 20 lines puzzle. So it is like a 10 lines puzzle, except instead of 10, it's 20. My original idea was, I want to do a 10 lines puzzle with doublers because that'll be fun. And I was like, but 10 lines don't really work with doublers because if you double a 9, it's not going to be part of a sum to 10. So easy fix, make it 20 instead of 10. Sold. But then it turned out that actually, as soon as I sort of started drawing lines in, I realized that I could just make an interesting 20 lines puzzle without doublers at all. So there's no doublers. This is just a vanilla 20 lines puzzle. The solve path here I was really happy with overall. It ends up getting all disambiguated by this black dot, which has become sort of my my sort of signature. I don't know exactly what tone you want to read it with, but the single type of clue disambiguator that drives a certain kind of setter up the wall to have only one of. I've come out in favor of if you're really happy with the logical path of your puzzle and you can disambiguate it with one clue that everyone who's solving the puzzle will know what it means, and it looks good in the grid, do that. So this is if this black dot had been randomly over here or something, I might not have been as big a fan of it, but being perfectly centered, I was plenty happy with this. People really liked this puzzle. Simon did this puzzle as well. I don't think I have anything else to say about this one, do I? Alrighty, the next puzzle is Cat's Cradle. So this is the typical Zeta weirdness kind of puzzle. So I had this idea that I thought was cool of, why don't I throw 4 mean mini grids together and then have clues that crisscross over them? So if you're not aware of how a mean mini works, what it is it's a 6x6 grid that you do with normal Sudoku rules, except not with the digits 1 through 6. It can be any set of 6 digits. So it could be 1, 2, 7, 8, 9, and 3 or something like that, whatever 6 digits you want. And so you have to deduce what the 6 digits are while you're solving the puzzle. And so in this case, actually, there's 4 mean minis, so you have to deduce what set of 6 digits it is for each of them. But there's also this weird little extra Sudoku between the grids, which is that in this puzzle, things see across the border, so these 2 cells see these 3 cells. So there's this extra weird Sudoku step here. And aside from all that weird stuff, it's just a region sum lines puzzle. But I was really happy with how this came out. It sort of ended up playing very naturally. It's funny, I tried this idea for so long and then I just gave up completely because I couldn't figure out how to make it work. But then what happened is I started on stream at the end of stream, I would just do 6x6 puzzles that people made, and Codec made a 6x6 region sum lines mean mini puzzle that sort of showed me, this really does have potential if I do it right. So then I sort of put this together sort of after that. So after I'd messed with this and then sort of given up on it, I went back and made it work after some inspiration from Codec. My only regret about this puzzle is that this is not intended to be a difficult puzzle. The break-in involves realizing that these 3 digits sum to this 1 digit. But for reasons that concern, I think, psychology and sort of how we perceive things, it doesn't stand out to a lot of people when they first look at this grid that this is a 1-cell piece on the region sum line. I think most people who've solved a lot of region sum lines puzzles look for those, but then just miss this one. So I think a lot of people ended up spending more time on this puzzle than I would have preferred, owing to the fact that this wasn't sort of as clearly advertised as it could have been. But overall, very happy with this one. There's no sort of parts in the solve path I'm unhappy with. It ends up flowing really interestingly around the grid, and everyone I've seen do a solve of this, like Ranks did a solve of this, and Nevaria did a solve of this, everyone has seemed to have fun and had it be relatively quick. And just about all of them find that it is easier than they think it will be by looking at the grid and the rules, which is good. Next up for the year is this puzzle, Pastiche. It somewhat surprises me, actually, that this one rates as low as it does. So this one actually ties with antimatter. I was really happy with this puzzle, but I think probably it varies how much you like various sorts of Sudoku things and how much you like various sorts of Zeta nonsense. I really like setting puzzles that sort of combine a bunch of variants together in some interesting way. So if you go back and look last year, I set the puzzles Potpourri and Cacophony, both of which sort of take a variety of Sudoku mechanics and put them together in a, I think, interesting way. Usually these puzzles, for whatever reason, then end up combining with some sort of classical techniques or a classical way of thinking or whatever. In this case, this is a mutant fish puzzle, as I guess most people who know what those words mean will look at the grid and immediately guess. And many people who don't know what those words mean will still look at the grid and immediately guess, because you don't really have to know the word for it in order to figure out what you're looking at. But It's interesting because this is one of those things where I came up with the break-in for this almost entirely in my head, just by sort of imagining these X's and this sort of central cross. It was backwards in my head originally. Originally, these cages sort of went L-shaped around the outside. But anyway, I'm really happy with the solve path in this. I really like a bunch of the steps in it. This thermo may have been too generous at the end of the day, but it's nice and symmetrical. So I was very happy with this puzzle. It did what I wanted it to do. It may not have done what everyone else wanted it to do, but it did what I wanted. Next up, we have the adorable baby dragon. So this is a 10 lines yin-yang puzzle. So I had long wanted to set a puzzle that's just one 10 line. Somewhat hilariously, I realized earlier today I was talking with someone about how I've always wanted to set a puzzle with just one 10 line, and I realized that in that conversation I forgot that I did set a puzzle with just one 10 line, which is this one. Simon solved this one, cracking the cryptic. And so here there's 10 lines, but there's also a yin-yang rule, which is that every 10 sum along the 10 line changes yin-yang colors and then sort of follows, if you've not seen the pencil puzzle yin-yang, it follows those rules. This puzzle is 4 stars in difficult primarily because if you've not ever seen the rules for yin-yang before, there's a lot of non-trivial deductions you have to make before you can really start doing yin-yang puzzles. And so I think this puzzle would be particularly difficult for someone who is reading the rules of yin-yang for the first time. I'm not a huge fan of that. It's sort of in the same genre of like, I don't tend to like set in puzzles, for example. But I was really happy with how the rules sort of fit together. And it did make for a very fun to watch Simon solve. And then also Simon even was able to see the dragon in the grid, which was my sort of question is like, is Simon actually going to be able to see the dragon or not? But actually, Simon was so impressed with the dragon that Simon speculated as to how much effort I must have put into making it look like a dragon, and wondering how on earth you could simultaneously make it look like a dragon while also making a puzzle. And the answer is I put literally 0 effort into making it look like a dragon. And in fact, the entire time I was making this puzzle, right up until the point I was going to upload it, this puzzle was called The Ring, because it was a single ring that ran around the center. But my boyfriend saw that and looked at it and was like, it's a dragon, call it something with a dragon. And so then I called it something with a dragon and he was happy, which is a much better name. It is much cuter to associate it with a baby dragon than to associate it with the movie The Ring, that A is very old and B is probably not very cuddly, and C would have made for a much worse cracking the cryptic thumbnail, I would bet. But anyway, that is the story of Baby Dragon. Last puzzle of the year is also a 10 lines puzzle. So it's actually funny that if you look at that, that's 3 cracking the cryptic features in a row that all involve 10 lines and 20 lines, which is not at all intentional. But here we go. This is Shrug. This is meant to be sort of like these are supposed to be the guy's arms, and this is his sort of face and beard and hat and, I don't know, ears or something. And he's supposed to be going, eh. That's supposed to be the reason why it is called Shrug. But the logic here ends up being very, very interesting and very unlike the other 10 lines puzzles. I was really happy with how this worked. I managed to work my signature in there again with the Z's sort of at the top. I was setting a lot of 10 lines puzzles for various purposes around this time, so most of those have not yet appeared in a publicly accessible form. News will appear at some point when they do appear in a publicly accessible form. But this one was one of, I said about 6 or 7 something 10 lines puzzles towards the end of this year. This was one of them, and I ended up publishing this one because of how cool everything sort of ended up fitting together at the end. Again, I'm really happy anytime I manage to get the solve path of something to be just like incredibly smooth, and this one I felt like I really managed to get it nailed down. And Simon's solve of it was likewise quite delightful and smooth, so I quite enjoyed that as well. And this one I also, by the way, I did a live reaction to, which people have really enjoyed going back and watching. So if you've not seen my live reaction to Simon solving this puzzle, you can also see that on the channel. So that is every puzzle I published on Logic Masters Germany this year. There is the slightest possibility that I will publish one more puzzle on Logic Masters Germany this year. I have one that is done that I'm going to publish soon. I don't know exactly when soon is, but don't worry, you have not heard the last from Zeta Puzzles. So you will see more in the near future. I will admit I am at this point somewhat burnt out from setting after doing Secret Santa and setting for some other purposes that I can't yet talk about. But I set a whole bunch of puzzles over the past month, so I probably am not going to set as many puzzles this coming month. But don't worry, I will definitely be back with many more puzzles, I'm sure. So I hope you look forward to those, and I look forward to hearing all of your comments about solving them. Because ultimately the thing that thrills me about making these puzzles is seeing people solve them and seeing people's reactions to solving them. So I quite deliberately always end all of my posts on LMD with "have fun, leave a comment if you enjoy the puzzle." And I really mean that, because I love to hear when people enjoy stuff. It just is, it's thrilling, and it motivates me to make more. So anyway, so if you want me to make more stuff, say so. I'm happy to hear it. But that's all from me for this year. Look forward to more from me next year. Bye for now.